We are a smaller campus. We're the urban campus, so we do not have the big football team. So we're located in Montgomery, Alabama. So I agreed to do a series of talks on America's national parks. I've been to a lot of national parks. It's been something I love traveling. I love traveling around the world, but I also love traveling around the United States. And so, especially when my children were younger and growing up, we took them to lots of national parks. And so I thought that a series of talks on the national parks might be of interest to you guys. So basically, I wanted to start by just saying that, when people think about the United States, I think they often think about the big cities, right? So New York, I know, is a big destination for people. And, they think of the Statue of Liberty, they think of Washington, D.C., and all of the wonderful museums there. They might think of Florida as a vacation destination, or they might think of Disney World and Disneyland. But we have a lot of really stunning national parks with some just amazing natural beauty. And when we think of the United States, we think of cities, but these places, and they're enormous, and in some cases, there's stretches of land with there are no people for just miles and miles and miles, and it's a really lovely getaway from regular life to go and visit one of these parks. So now I've got to forward to the next slide. Sorry, everything's not working. There we go. Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to talk about the National Park Service. So you can see the National Park Service is an organization that operates all of the national parks in the United States. It's a organization that has very coveted positions. It employs about 20,000 people who work in all of these national parks. And the National Park Service runs not only these kinds of national parks, but it also runs a lot of historic sites and museums. So for example, if, I went to one that was where Edgar Allan Poe lived, so it was a small museum and it's run by the National Park Service. So these jobs are very coveted. You have to apply and go through a screening process to get them. And as a history professor, I'm always encouraging my students to at least try and get a job with the National Park Service because it seems like a pretty good life. There are over 400 separate units in the National Park Service. So you can see from this slide, right, there are 63 national parks, but then the National Park Service also oversees a lot of other things like conservation areas, preserves, wildlife refuges, historic sites like Lincoln's birthplace, battlefields. So of course, all of the Civil War battlefields are part of the National Park System, and also things that would be qualified as memorials like Mount Rushmore. So today we're going to be talking about 3 parks in California. We're going to be talking about Yosemite, Death Valley, and Sequoia National Parks. And you can see there are some other parks in California as well, but these are the 3 that I picked. They're, I think, in many ways, the most interesting and picturesque. So first, we're going to talk about Yosemite. So Yosemite was established as a national park in 1890. It's about 1,200 square miles. I did not put things into kilometers, I'm sorry. And it contains 318 lakes and almost 900 miles of rivers and streams. So it is a very beautiful park with lots of varied types of natural resources and beauty. The highest peak in the park is called Mount Lyell, and that peak is over 13,000 feet. So it has some very high peaks in the park. Let me switch slides now. There's another view of the park from a different angle. This is what you do in Yosemite for the most part. You can drive through, and then of course there are places to hike and climb, but there are just these spectacular views everywhere you turn. This slide, you can even see several waterfalls in the background as well. Of course, all of these parks are known for containing lots of interesting wildlife as well, because as national parks, of course, you cannot harm any animals in the parks. And so there are lots of interesting animals as well. Here's another beautiful view of Yosemite. So when people go to these parks, they tend to, as I said, there are paved roads. So you get a permit, you drive through. People also like to hike. So there are lots of hiking trails. There are also campsites, so you can go and camp within the park if you're the kind of person who likes to camp. People also go fishing in Yosemite. Again, in some of these parks, you're allowed to do that with a license. So you can go fishing in Yosemite. Here are pictures of some of the animals. I did actually take the picture on the left. I did not take the picture on the right, but beautiful. I do remember seeing bighorn sheep in the park, though. They have these really fantastic bighorn sheep and lots of different other animals. The park also is famous for having tons of waterfalls. So as I showed you in that previous slide, sometimes in one view, you can see several waterfalls. And the tallest waterfall in Yosemite is 2,500 feet. So they've got some pretty large and spectacular waterfalls. This particular rock outcrop, I guess you would call it, is called Half Dome or El Capitan. It's one of the most famous in the park. It's very picturesque, as you can see. And so it's one that has been photographed over and over again. And here's some more photographs of waterfalls and trails. There are places you can rent bicycles in the parks as well. So these are, the nice thing about all of these national parks is that for the most part, you can take the activity level that you're comfortable with. So if you're older or you don't like hiking or something like that, or if you have really small children, you can just drive through the parks and you can still see a lot of this spectacular stuff. In some places, there will be places where you pull off the road and you park your car, and then maybe you have to walk a little bit to see something. But there are a lot of very easy ways to travel through the park. And then if you're more adventuresome and you want to hike and camp and ride bikes, there are activities that you can do like that. So if you're a more physical person and you like a more physical type of vacation, then there are lots of activities for you as well. Now, one of the reasons that Half Dome or El Capitan is so famous is because of this man. So Ansel Adams was an environmentalist and photographer. He was particularly known for his black and white photographs of the West. And the photograph on the right is one of his photographs. It's called Moon Over Half Dome. And some of his most famous photographs were taken in Yosemite. And that picture in particular has been reprinted in all sorts of things, posters, greeting cards, all sorts of things like that. And Adams really raised a lot of awareness about the importance of conservation and preservation in these parks because of his spectacular photography within the park. Now we're going to go on to Death Valley. So Death Valley is an interesting park. It was actually only made a park in 1994 by President Bill Clinton, but it was actually given its name in the middle of the 19th century. So it was given its name in 1849 when Western travelers who were headed to California for the gold rush came through this area and traveled through here and saw this incredibly bleak landscape with incredibly high temperatures, and they decided to name it Death Valley. So that's been its name since the gold rush. It's a below sea level basin, so it's lower than the area around it, and in fact, it's the lowest point in the United States. This park is much larger than Yosemite. It's actually over 5,000 square miles. Now, you might recognize Death Valley because some of the scenes from various Star Wars movies were shot here. So this area was used to represent Tatooine in the movies. And you can understand why, because you've got just all of these stretches of open sand dunes, rock outcrops, that sort of thing. So you can actually get very specific information online or you can get maps where it shows you exactly where all of the scenes from Star Wars were filmed. If you're a Star Wars buff, that information is out there for you. Now, one of the things that's probably, or one of the most famous things about Death Valley is the heat. So Death Valley is known for being extremely hot. Now that picture in the middle there, those are my kids actually when we went. It says 102. Obviously, 102 doesn't seem so hot anymore because we seem to be having temperatures of 102 other places as well. But Death Valley is actually the place where the hottest temperature on Earth has ever been recorded. In 1936, it reached 134 degrees in Death Valley. It is a dry heat. So, I'm from the South. I grew up in Louisiana. Now I live in Alabama. And here we tend to have, lots of humidity. So we tend to have wet heat. There it is very much a dry heat that does not make it any more pleasant or any less dangerous. If you put on the oven in your kitchen and you were to stick your head in there, that is what it feels like. It's very dry, but it's very hot. And the heat is really more overwhelming than I think you can imagine. And so as you can see, when you enter the park and then at various points throughout the park, there are lots of warnings about the heat. Again, like Yosemite, this is a park that has a paved way to get through. So there's kind of one direction, one road really that you drive through this park. And they really don't want you to get off that road. So there are a couple of ways that you can do some riding in a Jeep in the sand kind of thing. In some places, they do have some places where you can do that. But outside of some kind of organized thing within the park, they really don't want you to go hiking or venturing too far from the main road. And the reason is because, of course, it's very easy to get disoriented if you're out just in a big open area without without a lot of landmarks. And then also because of the heat. So one of the themes in at least the first couple of lectures that I'm going to do for you guys is going to be that, people forget to bring enough water. And even in the current culture where I think most of us carry around a water bottle, when you go to a place like Death Valley, just one water bottle is not going to do it. You need to have a lot of water to stay hydrated in this incredibly dry climate and in this incredible heat. And so when people wander off the main road and think they're going to go exploring with one bottle of water, that's not enough. And so occasionally there is somebody who, eventually gets disoriented or passes out, right? And there are people who die every year. You can see the sign over at the right, it has something about somebody dying in the heat. It's not like it happens every year or even, very often necessarily, but it does happen. And it's just a reminder that, in a place like this, you really can't overestimate how dangerous the heat is. Now, like I said, for the most part, the way to experience this park is driving through it. So this is what you're looking at as you're driving through the park. You just stay on the paved road. There are, as I said, a couple of places where you can venture off, and there are some places where you can rent vehicles, but for the most part, they want you to stay on the road. Now, even though you'll be on the road, you can see some interesting things. So in some places, there's some discoloration of the rocks due to the iron and mineral content within the rocks. So sometimes you see some interesting things like that along the way. And then there are some beautiful plants. So despite the fact that it's a desert, you can see some really beautiful plants. Of course, all of the plants in these kinds of places are protected as well. So you're not supposed to remove things in any of these parks. There usually are signs about that because one can imagine somebody might want to dig up that lovely cactus on the right and take it home and put it in their front yard, but you're not supposed to do that sort of thing. And occasionally you'll see an animal. So in Death Valley, obviously the wildlife is going to be significantly less than it is in some of the other parks that we talk about, but I did take that picture. So you will see coyotes. More likely you'll see things like scorpions and those kinds of insects, but occasionally you might see birds, obviously, and then maybe something like a coyote. And this, of course, is just a funny photo that we took this when we were in Death Valley. Again, I can't emphasize enough how hot it is in Death Valley. And I do remember when we were there, we spent the night, there's a little hotel, we spent the night there, and the heat was so overwhelming. The hotel was air conditioned, but the heat was so overwhelming that it kind of I'll say it gave me a panic attack. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I felt like this elevated sense of concern. Like I needed to be extra aware and make sure that my children were drinking enough water, that we were drinking enough water, because when you set foot out of any air-conditioned building, it just felt like a wall of dry heat straight out of the oven hitting you in the face. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is Sequoia National Park. This one is really quite different from the others. It's one of those things that until you see it in person, it's kind of hard to imagine the scale of these trees. So this park was actually also created in 1890 to protect these giant trees from the logging industry. So you can imagine how much lumber you could get out of one of these trees. And so luckily, while there was still time, it was recognized that these trees needed to be protected. This park is smaller than the others that we've talked about, or it's much smaller than Death Valley. It's only about 1,400 square miles, but this park is full of these enormous trees. So these giant sequoias are the largest trees in the world, and some of them are known to be as old. Well, the tree, there may not be any standing right now, but the trees can get, or they have known to get as old as 3,400 years, 3,400 years. An example is, well, here, I'll stop here for a second just to give you a sense of scale again. So that's my daughter standing inside of a tree that fell over. When the trees fall over like that, they keep them to use them, of course, for illustrative purposes, but also, you know, they can learn from the inside of the tree about how old it is and all those sorts of things. But you can just see how enormous these trees are. So the largest tree in the park is the General Sherman tree. It's 275 feet tall. It is about 1,000 years old. And at its base, it's 36 and a half feet wide. And the circumference of the tree at the base is 103 feet. And so I've got two pictures there, one on the left, that's just the tree itself, and then one on the right where it's me and my kids. And so you can get a little sense of scale, although it's still very hard to appreciate just how enormous they are until you're seeing them in person. Now, these trees, you know, are obviously protected from logging, but of course they're, you know, the Park Service looks after them and tries to protect them from other things as well. Surprisingly, fire is not the greatest threat to these trees. So these trees have adapted over time to defend themselves against periodic fires. So the trees have really, really thick bark that helps to protect the core of the trees. But obviously, we don't want fire to destroy the trees. We don't want them to have to undergo that trauma. So there are efforts when there have been fires to protect the trees. So on the left, you see a photograph from 2021 when there was a fire encroaching on the area, and they used protective foil to try and protect that tree from a fire that was moving in that direction. The thing that's really the greatest threat to these trees is drought. So when there's an excessively long dry season, that can be dangerous to the trees, and also various types of beetles. So I know you guys are aware of this, you know, in various places, right? There are different types of beetles that prey on certain types of trees, and they have that problem in the park as well. So again, that's something that the members of the National Park Service are always monitoring They're always, checking the trees to make sure that there's nothing like that. And of course, if they do discover that there's a problem, then they can start to work to come up with a solution. So the trees do a good job of taking care of themselves for the most part, but, the National Park Service is there to intervene when necessary to help keep those things alive. And this is just another picture just to help you get a sense of scale. These are kids, of course, so they're little people, but still, even if those were adults, you would be able to see just how large these trees are. And in some places in the park, not so much anymore, but they used to have places where you could drive through. There are a couple of spots where you can still drive through a tree, but obviously those kinds of things were done earlier in the 20th century, when there was, I think, a little less awareness about the long-term preservation. So they did a few touristy things like that, but we kind of frown on doing those things now, right? So they tend not to create new of those, but there are some old ones that you can still drive through, and that really shows you how big they are. Now I have a slide here to talk about how do you visit these parks? What are some things to know if you ever want to visit the parks? So, if you were coming from another country, especially, this would be really important information. It's important even if you live here, but it definitely would be important if you were planning a trip here and you hoped to visit any of these parks. So you have to plan far ahead if you're going to visit these parks. Depending on the park, sometimes they require reservations for entry into the parks. Because, in some cases, and it's not always the same with every park. Sometimes it might be a seasonal thing. It might be something that happens one year and not another year. They might have to limit the number of people who go into the park. So because of, concerns about pollution and human, what's the word I'm looking for? Humans going into the park and potentially threatening the natural environment. Sometimes they have limited the number of people who can go into any one park, and so they try and control that to some degree. So you definitely want to check about that. You do have to have a pass to get into a park. There is an annual pass that you can buy that allows you to get into multiple parks. So if you ever wanted to visit more than one park in a year, it makes sense financially to just buy one of the park passes, and that gets you a slightly cheaper rate getting into the parks. But you definitely have to look into all of that kind of stuff beforehand. You can pay for entry at the gate, of course, but you'll get a better deal if you do all this stuff ahead of time and you plan. If you hope to stay in the parks, because the parks do have hotels, those accommodations fill up far in advance. And the same is true with the campsite. So again, summertime, especially in the United States, would be when everybody's out there going to these parks. And so you definitely want to plan in advance if you're hoping to stay in the park, because you could very well get there and not have a place to sleep otherwise. You also need to check the weather. So that seems like an obvious thing, but some of these parks, the ones up in the north of the United States, won't actually open until a certain time of year after the snow has been cleared, and it's likely not to have any more snow coming down. So for example, Glacier National Park, some of the ones further north, they have the weather really is a bigger factor about access. And then also for packing reasons. So even though it's summertime, just like in other parts of the world, right, it can get very cold at night in these parks. And so you definitely want to be aware of the temperature changes. And then, of course, you want to pack light for the summer during the daytime, especially if you're going to be hiking or walking around a lot, because, as I said, some of these parks do reach some pretty high temperatures. So you want to be prepared for that. And then another gigantic warning that I'm going to put at the end of every one of these presentations about national parks is that you have to be safe. And I will say that, every year people die in these parks for being stupid, really, for not following the park rules. So in all of these parks, there are going to be some amazing vistas, places where you can walk out onto a rock outcropping or the edge of a canyon and look out and just see these amazing views, and everybody wants to take pictures. And there are always safety barriers with signs that say, don't go beyond this point, don't cross over this, loose rocks or whatever. And every year people go on the other side of those barriers. And I've seen it myself when I was in the parks, people going on the other side of the barriers to try and get that better photo. And people fall. Now, I've never seen anybody fall, but people fall. Every year people fall and people die in these parks because they're not regarding those signs. So the signs are there for a reason. It's not like there's a fence to stop you, though. You have to be the one to stop yourself. And especially if you're traveling with children, you want to make sure that you've got your eyes and your hands on your kids at all times, because again, there's some very dangerous cliffs and, the edges of canyons and things like that where you could easily get very, very hurt, or you could die if you're not paying attention to the rules. The other thing is to stay away from the animals. So people go into these parks and they often forget that these are wild animals. Now, the animals are used to seeing humans, they're used to seeing cars, but they are not used to interacting with humans, and they're not supposed to be. And so people forget that, and they try and pretend like these are petting zoos and they're going to be able to touch all these animals. And so every year there are people who get injured and sometimes killed by animals. So this photograph on the right, this was from 2010, and this is not the latest incident. This is just the best photo I could find, because somebody actually happened to snap the photo as this woman was getting hit by the buffalo or bison. So this woman was too close to the bison, and he came forward and he lifted her off of the ground and threw her. So if you look there's a series of photos that have been, taken out of this video footage where you can see the woman up and then landing. And this happens all the time. So again, if you go to these parks, stay away from the animals. Bison look big and clumsy and slow moving. They can actually run 3 times faster than a human. So you might be posing for a photograph and thinking that you're far enough away, and they will charge you, and they can do significant harm to you. And then, of course, finally, make sure to have enough water. Again, in all of these parks, and I'm going to remind people at every one of these lectures, a lot of people get themselves into trouble, either get sick or die or have to be rescued because they forgot to bring enough water. And especially on long hikes, you have to carry all of that water. So I think people often err on the side of too little because they don't want to carry it. So in 3 of these major parks that I'm aware of, and there might be more, there is actually a book that you can buy in the gift shops called, something about death in the name of that park. So I actually purchased these. I read them all, which is why I know so much about how people get injured and die in the parks. And this book, Death in Yosemite, is, it's a history of all the deaths in Yosemite from the beginning, whenever they started being recorded, right? And again, most of them are people being careless, people crossing barriers that they're not supposed to, people, doing things that they're not supposed to, people not bringing enough water. Some of them are accidental. So if you see the news story there, I posted that this is literally from this last week. A college student was climbing with her dad on that peak that's pictured. Unfortunately, that photo came out fuzzy, but it's El Capitan. It's the one that I showed you earlier. That's the widely photographed mountain. They were rock climbing or mountain climbing on that, and they got to the top and they saw a storm kind of coming in quickly. And so they decided, rather than hang around for any length of time, they were going to go down quickly. And she had new shoes on that had not been worn in well, and the grippies on the bottom of her shoes were a little slicker than they would have been had they been more worn in. And this is all from her dad. Her dad said earlier in the trip she had complained that her shoes were slipping a little, and her shoes slipped. She was probably hurrying, I'm guessing, because they were trying to get down before the storm came. So she was going down maybe a little more quickly than she would have otherwise, and her shoes were a little slick, and she slipped and she fell to her death while doing this with her dad. And this just happened. So again, I don't want to be doom and gloom in these talks, but I do want to emphasize that these are wonderful places to visit, beautiful scenery. You'll get some amazing photographs. You'll learn a lot, and you'll see some things that you never saw before. But you do have to take it seriously and remember that it is wilderness. And you need to, even though it's sort of domesticated wilderness for our benefit, you can still get very, very injured if you're not being careful in these parks. So I'm going to stop there and ask if anyone has any questions. There's an example of a downed tree that they carved a hole through so you can drive. Does anybody have any questions? Go to the chat room. Which of the parks is best to go with children? Honestly, I think probably Sequoia. There's really nothing dangerous there, and those trees are so amazing, and I think, like, especially for kids, they would just be stunned to see trees that size. But again, I think all the parks are good to go with kids as long as you are being safe. Yosemite maybe not would be one of the ones that's not as good because you do have a lot of drop-offs in Yosemite, and it's mostly just scenery as opposed to things that you interact with. Some of the other ones that I'm going to talk about are Yellowstone, Grand Canyon. For Grand Canyon, if you're traveling with children, you'll just really kind of be seeing it from the perimeter of the canyon, which is fine because it's spectacular. I think you just need to think about what level of interaction you want your kids to have with the environment, and then look at the ones that have more places where you can walk safely and maybe see more things that the kids would find interesting. So like Yosemite, or rather Yellowstone is a good one for that. Lots of walking paths that take you past some really interesting things like these, these hot sulfur pits and things like that, and in Yellowstone. So that's something like the kids can see bears and moose and bison